Dennis Prager here on this July 4th. I am hoping that you're enjoying our special July 4th show. You are listening to the best of the Dennis Prager Show. All righty, everybody, this is Dennis Prager, and I got to tell you, I said this to Alan, not just telling you. I'm very excited about my guest and the subject. It has really become one of my really fun hours when I talk with biographers of the presidents of this country. And I actually have restricted it thus far to the obscure ones. Who did we do? We did Martin Van Buren. I can't believe it. There's nobody in America who's devoted an hour to Martin Van Buren. I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign about my program, but who was the other one? We had was it Grover? No. He was too well known. Was it Rutherford Hayes? I got to remember the other one, and that was fascinating too. But now we actually venture to one of the best known presidents, and the new biography of Andrew Jackson, his life and times by H.W. Brands, who also wrote a best-selling biography of Benjamin Franklin, titled The First American. Professor Brands is professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Brands, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
My pleasure.
I always have a lot of questions for biographers, but first I want to ask you as a professor a question. If this book too becomes a bestseller, will you be resented by your fellow academics?
It's hard to say. They're probably, I suppose there could be a certain envy. It's not restricted to academics. Writers are notoriously envious of their successful peers. I haven't noticed it particularly, and so I really don't expect it to be any problem.
Only in that I know, for example, you are a professor, so it may not afflict you as much, but I remember Barbara Tuchman, who was not a professor, was resented by many historians because she was not a professor, and I don't think she had a Ph.D. in history, and they said, she just writes these popular histories. Yeah, and if something is popular, academia doesn't always have respect for it.
Well, it is true that the term popular among academics can be a criticism. I happen to think that the best popular historians are among the best historians. I think Barbara Tuchman did wonderful work.
Exactly. Oh, I'm sure you do.
Not only in terms of what she portrayed about the beginning of the First World War or the Black Plague in Europe, but for bringing a lot of people to the study of history who wouldn't have come otherwise.
That's an excellent point. It's one that ought to be made in the academic world. So I hasten to add for everybody that this book is not written in academese. It is actually written in accessible English. So I think people need to know that. Now, why did you choose Andrew Jackson?
Well, primarily because there's a huge gap between the appreciation for Jackson by Jackson's peers, in fact, his generation and the couple generations after, who considered him the towering figure of his times. Jackson was the great man of the first two-thirds of the 19th century. There are more cities, towns, lakes, squares, streets named for Andrew Jackson than for any other figure in American history. So Jackson's own
You know what? That's fascinating.
Well, in fact, when I was thinking about this, I tried to come up with some measure of Jackson's historical popularity, and I couldn't turn to public opinion polls because there weren't any at the time. I thought about looking at editorials in newspapers, but the trouble is that 19th century newspapers were, by and large, organs of political parties, and the idea that newspapers should be objective and should sort of flip a coin or render an unbiased judgment between candidates was unknown to people in the 19th century. If people think that certain news networks today have a partisan axe to grind, it was nothing compared to newspapers back in the 19th century.
Right, but at least they were honest then.
That's right. They
actually declared this. That's what Europe has to this day.
That's right. And so, for my purposes, that really wouldn't do any good. So the best thing I could come up with was the cities, towns, as I say, streets, squares that people named for individuals. And so I went to an atlas of the United States, and I looked in the back and just in the index to see how many places were named for various important figures. Jackson leads. Benjamin Franklin comes in second. George Washington is right up there.
Washington is behind Jackson.
He's behind Jackson. He's behind Franklin.
Well, wait a minute. What? You mean so many places are named Franklin?
Oh, in fact, Franklin is very close to Jackson. And, in fact, Franklin had a 50-year head start on Jackson because, of course, he died much earlier.
Right,
so those places could be named. But since I've written the book, every time I go to another city, I'm always on the lookout, and I'm amazed. Every city has a Jackson Street or Jackson Square or Jackson County in the States or Jacksonville or Jackson. They're all over the place. So anyway, I knew that Jackson's own age considered him to be the great man. In fact, in the standard periodization of American history, there's the Revolutionary era, the Colonial era, the Revolutionary era, the Early National era, and so on. There's only one that's named for an individual, and that's the Jacksonian era. So here's this guy who stamped an entire age with his character and his accomplishments. But the other thing that I knew is that Jackson's reputation in our time has fallen off considerably. And so we know
No
Jackson,
kidding. Did you see the New York Times? I'm sure you did. Review of your book.
Oh yeah. Well,
I mean, the guy has contempt for Jackson.
Well, that's it, and it's especially noticeable among academics. On the left of the political spectrum today, Jackson is often considered a great villain, and
because of his treatment of Indians?
His treatment of Indians, the fact that he was an unrepentant slaveholder, the fact that he was a militant expansionist, the fact that he was a duelist, a brawler. He was somebody who just doesn't sit well with the modern liberal sensibility. And so if you ask people I teach at the University of Texas, if I ask people on a college campus what they knew about Andrew Jackson, if you ask people at large what they know about Andrew Jackson, most people would be able to say he's that guy on the $20 bill who's having one of the great hair days of American history. And maybe they could associate him somehow or other with the emergence of democracy. But more likely they would be able to say, oh, yeah, Jackson's the one who drove the Cherokees out of Georgia on the Trail of Tears. Mm-hmm. Jackson was a slaveholder. Mm-hmm. Jackson was the one who killed a man in a duel. Mm-hmm. And so I was really struck by the fact that, well, what we remember about Jackson are what our generation would call his sins. But what we've forgotten about Jackson are his enormous accomplishments, the things that his own generation valued him for. And so I wrote this book as a way of explaining to myself, and then with luck, to my readers, what it was about Jackson that made his mark so important and so distinctive in his times. And what it comes down to, it's very simple. Jackson was known as the man who saved the Union when nobody else could, and he saved it not just once but twice. He saved it on the battlefield as a general at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. He saved it again as President of the United States when South Carolina and part of the South was threatening to secede from the Union. So Jackson held... By
the way, not over slavery.
No, and it wasn't over slavery. And this is very interesting because as we think about American history, our notion of secession is so closely tied to the Civil War and to slavery that what we forget is that several states of the Union were on the verge of seceding almost constantly from the 1790s when the bone of contention was the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Patriot Act of its times. And then in the 1820s and 1830s during Jackson's time, it was over a tariff. This was a tax increase. South Carolina got upset because taxes had been raised a little bit, and they threatened to leave the Union. And Jackson forced them to stay. And then, of course, later on, it became slavery. But this whole...
And that was the state he was from.
That he was from South Carolina. And so it had particular impact when he threatened to march an army of 200,000 men, lead them personally into South Carolina. In fact, a South Carolina congressman was heading home to South Carolina for the Christmas break at the end of 1832 when this secession crisis was coming to a head. He stopped in at the White House and asked Jackson if Jackson had a message for his constituents. And Jackson said, yes, I do. Please tell my friends in South Carolina. And he used that term advisedly because he was a native South Carolinian. He said, please tell my friends in South Carolina that if any of them breathe a word of secession, I'm going to come down there and hang them personally from the highest tree I can find. And when Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, a man who had the only president to have killed a man in cold blood in a duel, talked that way, South Carolina decided it was time to reconsider, and South Carolina backed down. So what Jackson's generation and the generation after Jackson appreciated about Jackson was that he had held the Union together at a time when nobody else could. His victory at New Orleans is often treated as, well, a footnote, almost a footnote to a footnote, because the War of 1812 is something of a footnote in American history these days. And the Battle of New Orleans, as every clever fifth grader knows, occurred after the treaty was signed, and therefore somehow it seems not to have counted. Well, in fact, it really did count because, needless to say, nobody at New Orleans knew a treaty had been signed, and secondly, the treaty hadn't been ratified. If the British had won the Battle of New Orleans, their strategy was to march up the Mississippi River, to connect with another British army marching down the Mississippi from Canada, split the United States in two, take the entire western half of the United States, and either give it to Spain, Britain's ally, give it to the Indians, or by some means to use it as a way of containing the westward expansion of the United States.
All right. We're going to take a quick break here. The book is Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times. H.W. Brands is the author. You're listening to The Dennis Prager Show. Dennis Prager here on this July 4th. I am hoping that you're enjoying our special July 4th show. All righty, everybody, you're listening to the Dennis Prager Show and an ongoing periodic series of biographies of the presidents. Let me tell you, folks, one of the reasons that I do this, and that is I think that I've come to the conclusion, and it's a tentative one, I'm certainly prepared to have my mind changed. My favorite way of learning history is now through individual events or individuals' biographies. I find that sweeping histories do not give me the insight, and I don't mean because of the amount of details. It's just there's too much in a sweeping history. So when I read David McCullough's book on the Panama Canal, I just really felt that I learned about that era, even though I only learned about the building of the Panama Canal. And we have covered obscure presidents, Martin Van Buren, and it was Chester Alan Arthur. By the way, Professor Brands, do you know anything about Chester Alan Arthur?
Sure. He turned out to be a president much better than anybody expected. When James Garfield was assassinated, the reaction was, oh, my God, Chet Arthur, president of the United States? But he surprised people. He grew into the office in a way no one had expected.
You blow my mind. You really do know. That's very impressive, I must say. Anyway, Professor Brands has written his newest book is Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times. And we were talking about, obviously, Andrew Jackson, but I just want to get back to the biographer's craft and then continue with, in fact, take calls as well. 1-8-PRAGER-776, 1-8-PRAGER 776. Did you change any of your thinking about Jackson when you did all this research?
Oh, yeah. I knew Jackson as kind of this caricature. I knew what his public persona was. I didn't know much about the private Jackson because I really had never read Jackson's letters. I had never gone into depth regarding what Jackson's own contemporaries said about him. And one of the striking things about Jackson is that although he had a rather ferocious public appearance, the personal side of Jackson, his family life, was as soft and tender as one can imagine. His lifelong, his 35-year marriage to Rachel, his wife, is one of the great love stories in American history. And it was a love story that began in confusion and uncertainty and ended in tragedy. But it was all the more touching for that.
What was the tragic end?
Well, the tragedy was that during the presidential campaign of 1828, Rachel Jackson's reputation was dragged through the mud by Jackson's opponents. And they made Rachel out to be an adulteress and a whore and all sorts of horrible things. And Jackson, in earlier days, before he became this national figure, before he became a candidate for president, had fought duels for Rachel's honor. In fact, it was in one of these duels that Jackson killed a man. But as a candidate for president, he felt he couldn't do this. He couldn't go out and challenge everybody who was publishing these dastardly things about Rachel to a duel. He essentially had to keep quiet. But Rachel suffered so under this criticism, and also looking forward to the thought that when her husband won, she would have to go live in Washington in the middle of this viper's nest and have to deal with these kind of criticisms for the next 4 or 8 years. It put an enormous strain on her soul. She suffered an emotional and nervous breakdown during the campaign. And her health wasn't good to begin with, but this compromised her health sufficiently that she had a physical breakdown, in fact died of a heart attack just after Jackson was elected. So at Jackson's moment of greatest public political triumph, he suffered his most grievous personal blow. He was so distraught that he wasn't even sure he could carry on. And the one thing that kept him going was his honest belief that his political enemies had killed Rachel, and they must not be able to get away with their victory. He would go on to Washington, and he would vindicate the principles on which he had waged the campaign, and therefore to restore the reputation of Rachel.
Did he remarry?
He never did, no. In fact, he certainly didn't have the heart for it. In his letters, and this is something that I didn't know before I did the research for the book, in his letters he constantly said that he could never be happy on earth again. He could never be happy until he was gathered together with Rachel in heaven. Now, in fact, Jackson was pretty sure, he was in fact morally certain, that Rachel was in heaven. He had some questions about whether he himself would merit heaven, but he firmly believed he could never be happy again on this earth. In fact, for several months, he was in a deep depression over Rachel's death.
Wow. When you sit down and write a biography of Andrew Jackson, you have to believe that you could do better than previous biographies. This is not a man who was lacked for biographies.
Interestingly, there have been a lot of biographies of Jackson, but not very many recently. As I was stating earlier, the admiration for Jackson, the interest in Jackson, has declined considerably in about the last 40 years. Between the mid-'70s and the early '80s, Robert Remini published a 3-volume biography of Jackson, which is a wonderful work. But since then, there hasn't been a full-blown biography of Jackson. And this kind of surprised me. Once I really got to thinking about it, I understood why, because Jackson has fallen into sort of the politically correct disfavor. But before that, there were all sorts of biographies of Jackson, and people who began biographies of Jackson could never seem to confine themselves to one volume. There were a wonderful 2-volume biography of Jackson written by Marcus Childs in the 1920s. There was a 3-volume, there was Remini's 3-volume work. There was a 3-volume work, one of the earliest ones written in the 1850s and 1860s by James Parton. But I thought it was time to do a 1-volume biography of Jackson because, like you, I happen to think that biographies are one of the most engaging ways to write history. Mm-hmm. You can really get to know one individual. And if this individual was important, was central to the development of his or her times, then that individual can serve as an instrument of vehicle for getting to know the broader period.
There was a caller who hung up, but calling in from Salem, Virginia, who said, how do you know that all the Jacksons are named after Andrew Jackson?
That's a good question. In fact, I don't. However, I have to assume that there is about the same discount for Jackson as there would be, say, for Franklin. Conceivably, some of the Franklins in this country are named for John Franklin or some other Franklin I've never heard of. The fact of the matter is, though, places get named for important people. And conceivably, there's a Washington in, Pennsylvania or Virginia or some places named for another Washington. And maybe there are, but if you
Washington, I think, would be, but, there's Stonewall Jackson and, I don't know.
That's true enough. And I suppose if I really wanted to parse this out, I would look and see at what time period they were named. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, though, that Jackson was one of the few nationally popular figures right up through and past the Civil War. Because although Jackson was a Southerner, he was a Unionist. And so by the 1840s, 1850s, there weren't any Southern Unionists left. If you were a Southerner, during and after the Civil War, nobody in the North liked you. But even after the Civil War, Northerners could admire Jackson because, despite being a Southerner, he was a Unionist.
When we come back, I want you to tell me what his opponents so hated about him and what he really did run for, on what grounds he ran.
Okay.
And much more. The book is Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times. You can call in at 1-8-PRAGER-776. H.W. Brands, B-R-A-N-D-S, is the author. And you're listening to The Dennis Prager Show.
Deep in the heart of Texas, that's why perhaps they all wear chaps. Deep in the heart of Texas. If tomorrow all the things were gone,
to start again with just my children and my wife.
Dennis Prager here on this July 4th. I am hoping that you're enjoying our special July 4th show. Continuing my periodic survey of the American presidents. The latest biography, and a fine one, of Andrew Jackson by H.W. Brands, whose biography of Benjamin Franklin, the first American, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, which, he writes extremely well. The fact that it's a Pulitzer Prize finalist is prestigious. There's no question about it. But that's not, for me, the most compelling case to read it. It's compelling because he writes well and knows his stuff. Andrew Jackson is the book. We're talking about Andrew Jackson. What, in a nutshell, would you say he most stood for, Andrew Jackson?
Andrew Jackson stood for the emergence of democracy in the United States. We take democracy for granted. We think that, with some exceptions, ordinary people ought to be able to vote. We all ought to be able to choose the people that lead us, our president, our congressmen, our senators, our governors, you name it. In Jackson's day, that wasn't taken for granted at all. Jackson was born in 1767. He came of age politically in the 1790s. In the 1790s in America, this country was a republic, but definitely not a democracy. The Founding Fathers, by and large, were suspicious of democracy. They believed that ordinary people didn't have the capacity, didn't have the responsibility, didn't have the intelligence to run government themselves. In the 1790s, most even of adult white males could not vote. There were property restrictions, there were residency requirements, there were other things that kept ordinary folks from going to the polls. During the first 50 years of Jackson's lifetime, until the 1820s, gradually the restrictions on voting began to fall away. And it became possible for someone like Jackson, a person who was born to no privilege, who didn't have any money, who was orphaned at the age of 14, who had no connections, to run for president by the time he became an adult. Jackson was the first common man to be elected president. And when he was, it took him 2 tries. The 1824 election returned for Jackson the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but he didn't have a majority of the electoral votes, and so the race went to the House of Representatives, where Jackson's, the second-place finisher and the fourth-place finisher, ganged up on Jackson and kept him from becoming president. Jackson's followers believed that what they considered the stolen election of 1824 demonstrated that the opponents of democracy were going to do everything they could to prevent ordinary people from choosing their own leaders. And so when Jackson won in 1828, this time by a decisive margin, it marked the emergence of democracy as the operating political philosophy of America. And we've never retreated from that. So with Jackson emerges the age of democracy. That's the thing that Jackson was valued for in his time. That's what Jackson remains historically associated with.
And yet he's not popular on the left.
No, that's the striking thing. Well, one of the reasons that Jackson isn't popular on the left is that even in Jackson's day, Jackson was the most popular political figure of his time, but at the same time, he was the most unpopular political figure. Jackson, like very many strong personalities, was a very polarizing figure, and exactly the same type of people who don't like Jackson today didn't like Jackson in his day. People who lived in New England, call it the New England liberal left, they didn't like Jackson at all. They were appalled that this rough-hewn Westerner, that this person with blood on his hands, could become president of the United States. They considered him an unlettered ignoramus. But in fact, Jackson appealed to that same, call them the red states today. Jackson might be considered the father of NASCAR Nation if there had been a NASCAR.
Right, though ironically, he's the founder of the Democratic Party.
He is, that's right, and it shows how far the Democratic Party has wandered from its roots, because the Democratic Party was originally the populist party. And populism today is more associated with the Republican Party than it is with the Democratic Party.
Now, what about the moral problems, especially the Indians? Let's review that. I mean, because you don't have to be on the left. I'm certainly not on the left to care about the moral question about the treatment of Indians.
The principal charge against Jackson is that he was the author of the Trail of Tears. He was the one who insisted that the Cherokees leave Georgia and migrate on a forced march out to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. And that certainly is true. What's often overlooked is the fact that Jackson's policy wasn't simply Jackson's policy. It was the policy of the United States. Jackson is somewhat notorious for, well, it sounds as though he's defying the Supreme Court. In a Supreme Court case of the Cherokees versus Georgia in the early 1830s, the Supreme Court found for the Cherokees. And Jackson is supposed to have said, now I'm pretty sure he didn't actually say it, but the words certainly reflect his feelings. Jackson is supposed to have said that Chief Justice Marshall has delivered his opinion, now let him enforce it. That sounds as though this president is arrogantly overriding.
All right, we'll find out what it really does mean in a moment. H.W. Brands, the book, and you see how interesting the whole subject and his approach is Andrew Jackson. I'm Dennis Prager, back in a moment. Dennis Prager here on this July 4th. I am hoping that you're enjoying our special July 4th show. You're listening to the Dennis Prager Show. I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying this. This is a real treat for me, Professor Brands. I just thoroughly enjoying this hour with you.
Well, good. I'm enjoying it, too.
Well, I'm delighted. The book is Andrew Jackson, and it's an ongoing survey on my program. I'm Dennis Prager of the Presidents, and it's a great way to learn American history. Before we continue with the assessment of Andrew Jackson, a moral assessment, etc., which is the part we're up to right now, if you were to recommend to me and my listening audience a couple of books on either the other presidents or just American history generally that you have particularly enjoyed and learned from, what would they be?
Most anything that David McCulloch has written is both solid historically and a great read. Starting with his Johnstown Flood, I think it was perhaps his first book, right up through his 1776 on Washington's army during the Revolutionary War. And we mentioned Barbara Tuchman earlier.
Right.
Her book, A Distant Mirror, is wonderful. The Guns of August, the Zimmerman Telegram. Those are people who take history very seriously, in the sense of wanting to get it right, but also take the craft of writing stories seriously. And to my way of thinking, the best history books are the ones that treat history as a great story. Sometimes the story is a big, sweeping one. Sometimes it's a relatively small one that opens out. You mentioned McCulloch's book on the Panama Canal. It's a small story, but there are ways of opening it out by introducing interesting characters and broad themes. So those are some recommendations right off.
And interestingly, in either case, is it a professor?
Right. And I think that's probably not accidental, because when you're writing for an academic audience, you can assume that there is going to be this core audience of people who have to read your book. These are your fellow professors, these are your students, and so there's less necessity, there's less incentive to make this thing a compelling read. Now, one of the challenges that I set for myself when I'm writing a book like the Jackson book, when I'm writing for a general audience, is I remind myself that my readers don't have to read this book, that they can put it down at any point. So I have to give them something on every page to make them want to turn the page. So they get to the next page, and there's got to be something on that page to make them want to turn the page.
Exactly. That's exactly what I in my profession have to do. I have to make the listener want to listen after the next break.
That's it.
And that is very important. Because if you have a captive audience, why should you be excellent?
That's right. And it's one of the pitfalls that academic historians can get into.
Yes. All right, let's return to Andrew Jackson. So you say it was American national policy to do what to the Indians that somehow exonerates what he did to the Cherokee in Georgia?
I'm not going to say it exonerates Jackson. Jackson was fully responsible for what happened. But my point is that it's easy for people in our day to forget that the policy of Indian removal, which is what Jackson was interested in. Jackson believed that Indians and whites could not live in peace side by side because 250 years of American history until Jackson's day had demonstrated that they couldn't. So Jackson believed that the only hope for peace in Georgia, and frankly, the only hope for the continued existence of the Cherokees, was to move the Cherokees away from the settled regions of the whites. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the Cherokees today remain one of the most vibrant, one of the most active and thriving of the Native American nations, when hundreds of Indian tribes who originally lived in New England, New York, Pennsylvania, have simply disappeared.
Wow. I mean, that's really remarkable that you were, I don't say you're wrong at all, but it is remarkable that you were arguing that in the long run it benefited the Cherokee. I mean, it is certainly counter to what most of your fellow professors are teaching in American history.
And I would be the first to admit that if I were a Cherokee, I certainly wouldn't thank Andrew Jackson for that. I would complain at the fact that American politics made that the only option. But in fact, Jackson understood the alternative to the Cherokees leaving Georgia was simply to be annihilated. That's quite an indictment of early American history. And my point is that the indictment is not simply resting on Jackson alone. It's the entire generation. If Jackson had tried to allow the Cherokees to stay in Georgia, he would have had to raise an army to do it. And Congress wouldn't give him the money to do it. He would have had to tell white soldiers to shoot white settlers, the ones who were persecuting the Cherokees, and they wouldn't have done it either. It was politically impossible for the Cherokees to remain peacefully in Georgia. And Jackson was one of the ones who understood that and looked it squarely in the eye and said, okay, so what
all right, and how do you deal with his rebuff of the Supreme Court?
Oh, well, that's an interesting one, because when Jackson said that Justice Marshall has delivered his opinion, let him enforce it, it's to our ear, that sounds like this defiant president. But in fact, the notion that the Supreme Court is the final word on interpreting the Constitution and the laws is a relatively new development. In Jackson's day, it was a majority opinion that the Supreme Court only spoke for the judicial branch. It didn't speak for the president. It didn't speak for Congress. And so the leaders of Congress backed Jackson in this. They said, okay, Justice Marshall has spoken for the judiciary, but the president has his own interpretation, aside from the fact that this particular Supreme Court decision didn't order the president to do anything at all. It was directed at Georgia, not at the president of the United States.
What about the charge that he brought about 5 years of recession because he would oppose a federal bank?
Jackson, like very many people, like very many populist Democrats of his day, was deeply suspicious of banks and the whole idea of banking. We're utterly used to banks and banking. There are hundreds, there are thousands in the United States. There were relatively few in Jackson's youth and a few more during Jackson's presidency. But Jackson believed that, well, in Jackson's day, the bête noire of the anti-bankers was the Bank of the United States. It was a private version of the Federal Reserve. And Jackson considered it, first of all, unconstitutional because he was a narrow constructionist. He looked at his Constitution and said, well, where does it say Congress can create a national bank? But the second thing was he thought it was undemocratic. He didn't think that private interests, private bankers, should have such a stranglehold over the American economy. Now, and so Jackson proceeded to destroy the Bank of the United States politically. It was a vindication of democracy, but frankly, it was bad monetary policy. This demonstrates that democracy doesn't always get things right.
Is it ironic that he is on the $20 bill?
Oh, I'll bet the folks who work for the Federal Reserve today. Oh, every time they see his face on
I'll
that 20.
bet they do. We'll be back in a moment. H.W. Brand's Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times. I'm Dennis Prager. Dennis Prager here on this July 4th. I am hoping that you're enjoying our special July 4th show. All righty, everybody, final segment, and I'll tell you, really flew with H.W. Brand's his book, Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times. Were you able to deduce any private views on slavery on the part of Andrew Jackson?
Jackson's view of slavery was that it was a necessary evil. He looked on slavery the way he looked on war. He didn't glorify war. He didn't glorify slavery. But he believed that war at times was necessary. He believed that slavery was necessary for cultivating the American South. Jackson was a person who was so popular during his time because he was very much a man of his times. Jackson, unlike somebody like Thomas Jefferson, didn't sit on a mountaintop at Monticello dreaming of a better world. Jackson had his hands full dealing with the world as it was. Jackson's world included slavery. If Jackson had been born 50 years later, his world wouldn't have included slavery. Jackson never became an apologist for slavery the way John Calhoun and some other Southerners did in the 1840s and 1850s. He always recognized that it was a brutal system of labor organization, but it was part of the world he inherited, and he accepted it as it was.
Very interesting. So it didn't conflict with any larger value system. You wouldn't say he was a man of some larger value system, or as that review that I cited about your book said, he loved the United States, and that was what could be said for him.
No question about it. And Jackson believed that the overriding issue of his time was the security of the United States. The thing he had against abolitionists was not that they opposed slavery and that he owned slaves. It was that they, to his mind, threatened the security of the Union. In fact, it turned out to be exactly right, because by agitating the slave issue, the abolitionists and the Southerners who opposed them polarized the politics of the United States in a way that threatened the security. Jackson believed that the one thing the United States could do for the world was to demonstrate that ordinary people could govern themselves. And this was an open question during Jackson's day. And anything that challenged the unity of the United States threatened this democratic experiment and had to be opposed.
Do you think he would have been shocked to learn that eventually women would vote?
Not at all. No. In fact, Jackson was a Westerner. And it was in the West that women were first allowed to vote, some of them during Jackson's own time. Because in the West, people recognized that women played a vital role in the economy, in the society, in the politics of the era. And so Jackson would have appreciated that women, well, his wife Rachel, he would have thought that she would make a good voter, and any number of women that he grew up with on the frontier would have made good voters too.
What's your next book?
I'm working on a book on the Gilded Age, the 35 years in American history after the Civil War.
All right, you let me know.
Okay.
Thank you. H.W. Brands, Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times.